we're going to talk about one specific project that we carried out on behalf of Farming Connect with Intection, which is the Parasite Management Project. And we're going to discuss this evening part of the outcomes coming out of that project. And it's focusing on parasites in the spring around this time of the year. So very quickly, quick background on the project. It ran last year from March to September. It's all about controlling roundworms in livestock. It was in cattle and in sheep. As I said, it was Intection delivering this on behalf of Farming Connect. And very quickly, I'm not going to dwell too much on the main background, but the main project aims and objectives was to look at implementing on-farm changes, working with a network of farmers throughout Wales, implementing the latest advice and recommendations from SCOPS, which is the Sustainable Control of Parasites, and COWS, which is the equivalent one for cattle, Control of Worms Sustainably, and looking at using regular fecal egg counting on these farms. They were using our FECPAC platform, which is Intection's platform. You can see a picture there, but this is relevant for anybody doing fecal egg counts through a vet or any commercial provider. The part of that, as well as monitoring worm burdens, looking at anthelmintic resistance or efficacy at least, and managing situations where we did have resistance and treatment efficacy issues. The an overall aim, obviously, is to try and improve stock performance. If we can better manage parasite burdens and manage any resistance issues that are out there, hopefully we'll see an improvement. And also looking after, I think, the development, looking after the new generation wormers we have, the 4th and 5th generation wormers, the orange and purple groups, trying to slow resistance down to those and looking after those. So that's the overall background. Just quickly on the farmers. So we had 9 focus sites, which are Farming Connect's focus sites throughout Wales. As you can see there, the list is there. I'm not going to dwell and talk about anybody specific at this point. The 2 bottom farms were focusing more on cattle than they were on sheep, and the first 7 were focusing on sheep largely. And these will be the focus for this webinar, seeing as we are a kind of a sheep topic. And so we're going to just concentrate this evening on one aspect of the project, which was what we found at this time of year. So very timely issues in parasite issues in spring lambs. And the main parasite we tend to think about is Nematodirus. And we can look at Nematodirus and the role of fecal egg counting around that. Concentrating, obviously, we're coming towards the end of April now into May. This is the period we're looking at. So, as I said, Nematodirus seems to be the focus, and the other worms, which we call a group called strongyles, are not often considered. I've got a picture here at the bottom of Nematodirus egg and strongyle eggs. So these are eggs we look at when we're doing egg counting, and you can see they are very distinct. So Nematodirus is very easy to pick apart within an egg count from other worms. Those strongyle eggs there, those are from different species of worms. They could be Telodyssasia, Trichostrongylus, Homunculus. We can't tell from looking at the eggs which species it is, hence we call them strongyles. So just a reminder, we tend to focus on Nematodirus now, and we think of the other worms, the strongyles, being more later in the season. What we wanted to do within the project, and what I'm going to look at this evening, is answering 2 questions, or challenging 2 questions, if you want, sort of around this. One of the questions is, can we use fecal egg counts for lambs in the spring? And the second question is white wormer, the 1BZ, the white drench, is that the best dose to use at this time in the year? I'll come back to those questions. I thought maybe we'll very quickly discuss the background on Nematodirus and a little bit of background. I'm not going to really focus in detail on this life cycle, but those of you who know about it, anybody's had issues with it, knows it can be a particularly nasty worm at this time of year. If we have a mass hatch and the conditions are right, and a high challenge, it can leave in quite high detrimental problems for performance, and actually quite often deaths in these young lambs. I think the life cycle of Nematodirus is similar to life cycle of other worms. So we have adult, if I just get my laser pointer up, we have adult kind of worms inside the stomach of the animals. these lay eggs, and the eggs in the dung then develop into larvae and hatch, and the larvae will hatch onto the grass. Sheep come around and actually pick up that grass with infective larvae, and those larvae actually grow into adults, then inside the stomach of the animals, and the cycle starts again. A few things to talk, this is a typical life cycle. The difference between Nematodirus and other worms we find is for your common worms we find later on, from when the adults kind of come out in the dung here to when the development happens, actually is quite a short period, between anything from 3 to 20 weeks, depending on the conditions. So that hatch kind of tends to happen within a season. With Nematodirus, tend to be different, is the majority of eggs will sit dormant in dung particles or in the soil. They'll sit on the soil and they'll wait for about 12 months. So when we think about having Nematodirus issues on a field, that challenge came when the parasite burden was dropped there by whatever was grazing that field last year. So any Nematodirus issues now, eggs would have been laid this time last year, normally. So it takes about 12 months before the development happens. And for this development to happen as well, we need certain conditions. So it normally needs a cold kind of spell during the time where it's sitting dormant. So we have a colder spells over winter, and then there's kind of a warming up then in the spring is a bit of a trigger for these guys to actually wake up and become infective. The reason it can be particularly damaging is when they actually wake up from their kind of deep slumber, if you went in the winter and come out in the spring, if that all happens at the same time, so if we have cold weather fairly late on and then it warms up all of a sudden, this hatch of eggs can actually happen in a very short kind of window period. Within a matter of days or a week and stuff, we could have a lot of eggs hatching at the same time. And if there's a heavy burden in the fields, these lambs, young vulnerable lambs, so these lambs wouldn't have seen much of a challenge of worms before in their lifetime. Picking up a high challenge, it can actually cause these big issues. So when we have a mass hatch happening, on heavily challenged fields, that can happen. One of the reasons, so I question the role of fecal egg counting, and I'm going to advocate it, but a lot of people, as we're going to come to, say we shouldn't be using egg counts, so we're going to be careful. The reason is, I'll explain the reason why here, is when these larvae go into the stomach of the animals, the larvae go into the stomach, it takes 3 weeks, about 3 weeks for those, or it can be as short as 2 weeks, but it's kind of 14 to kind of 20 days normally, for them to actually develop into adults and lay eggs again. So when you're doing egg counting, and this is true for any worm, the eggs that we pick up in the dung, that we detect by our egg counting technique, is from adult worms, which means those worms have been there in the stomach of the lambs, developing for anything from 2 to 3 weeks. And when we have this mass hatch, even the young larvae stages inside the stomach of the animals here, they can be very damaging to the lambs' stomachs and intestines and so on. And we can get big issues, and as I said, deaths. And that can happen when they're at larvae stage. And therefore, if that's happening within that 2 or 3 weeks, this disease, then obviously egg counting doesn't pick it up. Okay, so that's the kind of reason why we tend to say we have to be careful with fecal egg counts. I think the other things I wanted to say around this, that's the main thing. It takes a year to develop, and it can be very damaging. And as I said, it is associated with being a spring parasite. We tend to think of Nematodirus now, but be wary. We can see problems, through the summer, and we can have a second hatch in the autumn. I'm not going to dwell too much on that now because we're talking about the issues right now. But if things are changing and developing, we can have issues later on. So I think that's very quickly a quick background to that parasite we're dealing with, and some of the challenges around that. So when we're looking at this, is considering what to consider about treatments and actually what triggers us to go and treat and what we need to think about. There's a lot of things we think about. It's the history of the fields they are grazing. So if you remember, I said any Nematodirus issues out there kind of today, would have been dropped there last year. So if you're grazing pastures of lambs in that kind of vulnerable kind of age, on fields that had lambs on last year, and especially on fields you had some Nematodirus issues last year, then that's kind of a really good kind of sign. If, for example, you were grazing fields that only had cattle on last year or for the last 2 years, maybe you feel a bit safer about those lambs and stuff, okay? So it depends what's been grazing there before. The age of the lambs is important. So lambs need to be 6 weeks of age, before we see any eggs anyway. And they don't really start grazing until 3 or 4 weeks of age, kind of thing. So they, that the age of lambs, they need to be old enough to be grazed into picking up parasites. So it tends to be, that kind of the vulnerable kind of age is anything from 4 or 5 weeks at the earliest up until kind of 8 to 10 weeks would be quite a risk period for lambs for Nematodirus. And clinical signs as well, to look out for: intense scour, dehydrated quite often with ticked up bellies. You can see the kind of sunken eyes of dehydration. Some of the signs might be a lot of lambs hanging around in water troughs as well. So, spending a lot of time in water troughs, so they're very, very thirsty. But sometimes the only sign we see is sudden deaths. And sometimes it's the biggest, nicest lamb in the bunch and stuff, and you go to shepherding in the morning and they're dead. That can be a sign of Nematodirus as well, because those bigger, stronger lambs are probably grazing more and potentially taking on more challenge. We've got to be careful as well, not mixing this up with coccidiosis. We're not covering coccidiosis here, but coccidiosis is one that actually, can be confused with Nematodirus. It infects at the same time and has similar signs. Okay, it has similar signs to this. So you've got to be a bit careful around that. The other tool we've got is, I mentioned the SCOPS body. On the SCOPS website, there's a Nematodirus forecast. So the SCOPS Nematodirus forecast is actually a really useful and vital tool. It is basically the website's there. If we have time towards the end, we might pop onto the website and see what it looks like today. But you can actually zoom in on your country and have a look at it. So your part of the country you're in, etc. And it gives you the risk for your area. And this is the risk for hatching. So we talked about the conditions and needs for hatching. We need the moisture, we need kind of warmth, etc. And so there's some very clever people working with meteorological data, within weather stations situated around each dot. And they use that to predict when the hatch might happen. I would say, the word forecast is there. It's like the weather forecast and stuff. It is a forecast, and things might change in terms of where you are, whether your altitude compared to where the station is, and whether you're north facing, south facing, etc. Those can alter that forecast a little bit. But that's a really good tool as well. So as well as that, we're here to talk about the role of egg counting, and can we use fecal egg count for lambs in spring? As I mentioned briefly before and stuff, many advise not to test at this time of year. And as I mentioned, it's the risk of disease happening in lambs before Nematodirus eggs appear. But our answer is yes, we can. However, we're not disagreeing with all those facts. We think it's really useful. We just need to be really careful how we interpret results. This is important for all egg counts you do, is actually, having an egg count, is massively useful, but actually what does it mean, in terms of the context of the time of the year and the age of the lambs, etc. So I think we can still use egg counts. And the reason is, FEC will often detect, FEC is actually really, a good detection of adult parasites. So a lot of people kind of mistake that kind of first thing, we shouldn't be using fecal egg counts for Nematodirus. A lot of people think it doesn't work for Nematodirus. It does. It's really good at picking up adult Nematodirus worms, okay? It's just that issue, we can have disease before they're adults. So it will detect when adults, but problems can occur before then. So when we're interpreting, that means we might do an egg count, and even if it's a low or zero fecal egg count, we might still go in with a wormer if other conditions allude to that. So if the kind of forecast says it is, and the clinical signs are there, and the history, etc., you've considered the other things, then you would consider it. So you're going to probably think, well, why on earth is this fool kind of telling me to do egg counts if we're still going to dose when it's a 0 or a low fecal egg counts at times. So this is where it comes in, but, eggs can appear before clinical signs show up, and it can appear during low risk periods. So for example, I'll give you an example this year, the hatch has been more gradual this year probably. So in terms of having a mass hatch and masses of disease, the hatch has probably been much more gradual because we had some nice weather early on, end of the winter, kind of into the early spring. It's been, fairly warmish weather. So we think some of these Nematodirus eggs would have hatched early on, maybe end of February into March when there's no young lambs on the ground, depending on your farm, or the lambs aren't grazing yet. So some of the hatches probably we're predicting has been much more gradual for the majority. So maybe slightly, lower risk potentially from that this year. And sometimes the lambs look fine. Focus says actually we're at a lower or medium risk, but sometimes the fecal egg counts are there, trigger an earlier treatment, and actually we can avoid potential performance loss and also reduce contamination of Nematodirus eggs. We've seen this we see this actually very often, where we see that fecal egg counts are there before anything else. So it can trigger earlier treatments and going in that little bit sooner and avoiding problems. The other one is, and this is quite an important one for us, we say we're considering Nematodirus. The other one is actually quite often the fecal egg counts show actually lots of other stronger eggs. So those other worms we normally associate with later on in the kind of summer, we quite often see stronger eggs, which may well change your drench choice, sort of your wormer choice. Which leads into the second part of this kind of, my second question, if you want, is white wormer, that white drench, is it the best dose now? And again, to recap, white drench is probably the go-to wormer for the first and often the second dose on many farms. We've got some early lambing flocks, who might go in there for the second dose as well. And despite, we know that there's widespread resistance issues with white wormers for worms later on in the summer, but actually they seem to be pretty effective still against Nematodirus on the majority of farms. There's a couple of exceptions, but even though we've got massive issues with wormer resistance and white drench later on, for Nematodirus, it still seems to be pretty effective for the majority of us. And it's also a cheap option when there are lots of lambs on the ground to dose. And probably when there's lots of Nematodirus, it is a pretty good wormer at getting to those earlier stages of the parasite and might be slightly better than the other worms. Again, the other wormers, sorry. However, so our answer to is white wormer, our answers are actually white wormer isn't the best option always, because if Nematodirus, and what we say here, if Nematodirus is the only worm being targeted, then yes, white drench is definitely the best choice. It still appears to be the best choice for that. But as I alluded to in that last slide, we often see other worms present in pretty high levels early on, okay? And I'll come to this in more detail. Medium or high strong egg counts, then, anybody who's got white drench resistance against these worms, they can change to use other effective wormers. And if those strong guile worms aren't properly controlled, that we're missing them and they're not controlled, it can affect lamb performance and also contribute to prolonged pasture contamination. So those strong guiles that are surviving that wormer treatment are continuing to kind of being, the eggs are kind of coming out, contaminating those pastures, and which will mean higher worm burdens later in the season for you as well. So that's the reasoning. And if I turn now in terms to what did we find on the project farms, so we'll focus on the graph. So from our 7 sites, the 7 focus sites that are using the kit, we had 19 lamb tests done in April and May. Well, there's one in March for a very early lambing flock, but you can see 17 tests between the 7 farms. 19 tests, sorry, up until the end of May, which is the typical period for we associate with Nematodirus. And these bars here, this is the egg count. So these are the egg counts in eggs per gram, okay? We count 500 eggs per gram and above is pretty high. 200 to 500 is a medium count, okay? So a lot of them are in the medium count. But for young lambs, for that first dose, we probably would still dose on a medium count because, they're very vulnerable, they're young. So they're kind of very vulnerable and young at this stage. But I think, so this is the total egg count from each of those tests. The important thing here is the mix of worms. So you can see the kind of pinky salmon kind of colored bars are what's made up of Nematodirus kind of eggs in the egg count. And the more purpley or bluey bars, depending on your screen, how it looks, are this bluey purple one, are Strongyles, yeah. So Nematodirus is that pinky one. Strongyles are the kind of bluey, kind of purpley bars there, okay? So what's really interesting here, as I talked about, we focus on Nematodirus, but look how many purple bars we have. Look at the amount of Strongyles. Up until here, other than this count here, these counts here are dominated by Strongyles. This was only Strongyles, and it's 400 eggs per gram, which for lambs of 6 weeks of age is pretty high, okay? And here, you'd say probably 60-70% of them are Strongyles. And towards the end of May, we had quite a high Nematodirus kind of percentage there. But really interesting, and these are farms widespread throughout Wales, that we are seeing here. So like I said, in 73% of counts, Strongyles were dominant. So that's quite a high percentage. We've done other work on this in previous years with our various clients and various projects, some of them Farming Connect that we've done. We commonly say, quite often 40 to 50% of counts we do at this time of the year, Strongyles are high enough for us to possibly use another wormer rather than white drench. So, as I said, it's dominant, and Strongyle levels are high enough in 8 of the 9 out of the 19 tests, 42% to warrant not using 1BZ, that white wormer, if resistance is present. That's really important to actually point that out, okay? So yeah, the other thing is encouraging. We were encouraging our users to do regular fecal egg counts, to do a lot of fecal egg counts through the season. So we're really happy with the usage. The majority of farms did quite a lot of testing. So really encouraged. We had 19 tests done on lambs before the end of May. And the other thing, just come on to the next. This is the same graph, okay? So I just kept it on there, just to make a few more points. So what changed on the project sites? The presence of so many Strongyles, was a surprise to the majority of our farmers. So it did surprise them. And most of them knew that white wormer wasn't effective against those worms. Therefore, they changed to use another group, which would work better for both worms. And we've got to remember, the other wormers will also control Nematodirus. There's another myth that's out there, is that only white worm will kill Nematodirus. It is one of the better wormers, maybe, but other wormers will deal with it perfectly well, especially when, with lowish levels, okay? So sometimes we can trigger to change that. And this resulted in better early lamb performance for many of our sites. And we detail that in some of the case studies. So on the Farming Connect website, there is a sort of a page for this project, and you can see the full project report on some of the case studies there. I'm going to focus on one of the farms as a case study, David Lewis, Holton Hall up in Bangor and Dee. This is a quote that he told us. Since we changed wormer for the May lamb dose, based on fecal egg count results and detection and our advice, the lambs just flew, and most have been sold as finished lambs by the middle of August. So to give you a bit of a background and a bit more detail around this, so David Farms, he produces about 1,200 lambs, and he's early lambing, so it's January, February lambing, targeting early lamb sales for the majority, using kind of creep feed, like a home mix creep feed. And yeah, he was one of the ones that recorded those high strong counts in late April. Again, early lambing, so he had already wormed these once without using egg counting, I believe, because that was just as we were starting this project. And they were wormed in early April, just under 3 weeks before. So he was surprised that, they were within the 3-week period. He was surprised to see any worms there at all. And they were quite unsurprised to see the high Strongyle one. So normally he would have, white wormer was normally used as a second dose in this farm, and sometimes a third, because he was early lambing. And the second dose was still falling in late April, early May. He was actually thinking, well, we're still in the Nematodirus season. That's what I'm hearing from people, our expertise, etc. So he was going in with a white wormer for the second one as well. So yeah, we were suspicious of white wormer resistance there. It wasn't proved. Conditions dictated we couldn't actually prove this here, but they were advised to use a levamisole wormer to try. And then in terms of the impact we had, the table here shows that significant shift in lamb performance between years. So 2018, we can see here. So this just shows how many lambs were left at different. So there were a similar number of lambs born. He was starting to sell lambs kind of end of May, June, that early market kind of, or sort of probably in May and June. But, 2018, the year before, there were 400 lambs left on the farm versus only 215 last year when he actually changed to this pattern. 150 lambs left in the end of August, only 15 lambs left in the end of August in last year. And, out of those 150 here, he had 100 lambs left in November even, because he took off the creep feeds, put them more on a store, and actually, they were still kind of running around, a lot of them still running around the farm in November. So that's quite a significant shift. And 2018, as I said, was probably comparable in terms of its lamb performance to previous years. Now, one thing to note here, we don't want to take all the plaudits. Well, I'd like to take all the plaudits, but it's important that we actually do share it out because there are other things at play. He has changed a lot of grassland management. He's put a lot of new lays in for growing and finishing lambs. He's been a lot of genetic improvement. He's been working with breeding companies using performance recorded sires, and the improvement's been done over a few years. So he's now seeing the benefits of that. So he does say there's a lot of things that are actually helping this. But what he did say, I'm pretty sure that this change of that wormer, just that one choice to change a wormer, it was the last piece of the jigsaw puzzle in a way to actually get that performance out. Sort of, we have to remember, we might do a lot of work on grassland and genetics and whatever and stuff, but if we've got disease issues, underlying disease issues that aren't detected, they can be, they won't, those animals won't realize their potential in that system, if there's one of those kind of things that are missing. So he's convinced, it definitely had quite a big impact. So yeah, the likelihood is the high strong gale challenge early in the season wasn't being controlled by the routine white wormer in previous years, and that was holding back lamb performance. Okay, and that's what we've kind of included kind of there. What's the benefit? We sat at this kitchen table and tried to kind of work out a quick rough estimate, really, and this was words from David himself, really. But he reckons that it was worth about $2,500 to him in terms of that performance shift. He was on a contract, and the change in lamb value over a season, if you think of these 100 lambs sold here in December, versus those lambs now were shifted to sell probably June, July, the value of lambs on his contract was a £10 difference in those lambs. So 100 lambs, that £10 difference in that seasonality, that's £1,000. Obviously, more lambs going early, a lot less creep feed used. And okay, so there's a lot less lambs end of July there and stuff. And they would, sort of pattern was earlier. 6-7 tons of home mix. That's about £1,400. And he actually wanted to add this in. He said, well, actually, the labour savings. He was somebody, they fatten a lot of cattle. They got arable as well. So he does use paid, sort of paid for labour. And so, yeah, there's a big change there. And then, yes, so there's £200 of lost labour there. So, in terms of handling these lambs, crutching, etc. What was I going to say? And more benefit of more grass available for grazing. Just a quick note before we finish off on collecting samples. Yes, collecting samples is challenging. This is Irwell, one of our farmers, collecting samples. They are small pellets, and if you're searching amongst long grass, if you're lucky, it can be challenging, but it's well worth the effort and spending that time. If close to pens, bring them in and separate 30-40 lambs to a side pen. Just wary of time. Just the last few slides of a little bit of advice to you coming out of this project. So when to test and how do we interpret results? So start testing as soon as lambs are around 5-6 weeks old. There's no eggs before this, and probably 6 weeks of age you start seeing eggs anyway. Test all groups separately where it's feasible, because we do see a massive variation between fields, if you remember the history of those fields, but also between lower and higher ground. Anybody's kind of got that system, as temperature is a key factor for the hatch. So where feasible, we will find differences between groups. And interpreting results, as I said, please take care this time of year, even if it's in the low, medium category, below 500 or even 0, we still advise to worm for Nematodirus if there's a known history of it, evidence of clinical signs and conditions are correct. use that forecast, the SCOPS forecast, and also very importantly, ask for help. Speak to your vet, your animal health advisor, in the stores who are selling wormers, etc. Have a chat to them as well. And what wormer to use, just to recap, if no strong gulls and Nematodirus treatment is needed, white wormer is fine and probably the best option. So if there's very little strong gulls there, and Nematodirus is the main one, white wormer is absolutely fine. Otherwise, choose a wormer which is effective against strong gulls. But the big question is, do you know? The resistance is quite a big thing. We might touch on this potentially. We might do another one of these later on in the season about other topics, and resistance might be one of them. So keep an eye out for that if that happens. But that's the big thing. Do you know actually which are which wormers are effective in your farm? Because you might be surprised. So summary to finish off. Spring parasite issues are tricky to deal with. Okay, be careful about that coccidiosis as well. Yes, you can use fecal egg counts, but take care, and you can still worm on a 0. You may well be surprised by what else you find. And white wormer isn't always the best option. It often is, but it's not always. Watch out for that second hatch in the autumn, as I mentioned. And in terms of future work that Farming Connect are doing, some of these demonstration and focus sites are continuing some parasite monitoring activities. The product itself is finished. There's some continuation, and there's 3 EIP projects as well, which are looking to roundworm control. We're actually involved in all 3 to some extent. There's one on cattle, one on managing ewes in the lead up to and shortly after lambing, and there's another EIP project just going to start this summer, hopefully, on the health benefits of using herbal leaves on the farm. Thank you for listening, Jochen Brando.